Hey guys, welcome to another OmniFocus Fitness video. Today we're going to be discussing calories and we're also going to be covering calorimetry. So how we measure the amount of calories in food as well as the amount of calories that we expend. So how do scientists figure that out? How do scientists go about figuring out our metabolism? How much our metabolism uses as far as calories? How many calories are in food, and we're also going to break down the definition of calories, because knowing the definition in kind of physical terms, in physics terms, it's not very satisfying. It really isn't. Just being able to spew out that one line definition for what a calorie is, and I'll go over that in the coming section, doesn't really explain what it is and where we got that definition from. So I'm going to go into that as well as a little bit of a history lesson on how we came about with figuring out calories and why we use calories. So this should be a really informative video. All of them are informative, but I think this one's going to be kind of cool, kind of unique, and I really hope that you enjoy your stay. That said, of course, these videos I tend to drone on for a while because I've got a lot of information to share, of course all scientifically backed in the article below. But that being the case, there is a menu system after this introduction for those of you that would like to skip to particular points in the video. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and move on, shall we? Let's do it. So what is a calorie? Most people, if they have some idea of that one-line definition, they'll say it's a unit of energy that increases 1 gram of water's temperature by 1 degree Celsius. And that is such a bullshit explanation, and I hate it. I really do, because people just spit it out and then that's it. We're done. Okay, that's what it is. But that is such a terrible way of explaining what a calorie truly is. And that's really the whole purpose of this video, is so that you understand what a calorie truly is. So we're going to take that definition and then we're going to break it down into little parts so that we fully understand what a calorie is. But as far as an applicable idea of what a calorie is, because I'm not going to be able to define exactly what a calorie is in this one section, but throughout the video you'll get a better understanding of what calories truly are. But kind of an example of that would be like a fever. If you get a fever, from a physiological standpoint, if you get a fever, your body increases body heat. And our body is majority water, and that plays a factor, of course. So to increase our total body heat, so our overall body heat through, again, a fever, our body has to increase its metabolism. And by an increase in metabolism, that means that yes, we do expend more calories. And that is kind of a sensical physiological idea of what a calorie is, but that still doesn't fully explain what the definition of a calorie is. And for us to do that, we need to understand how we are able to determine the caloric level in foods as well as the caloric level of our metabolism. Or at least that's an approach, and that's the approach that we will use. So we're going to go into explaining what calorimetry is, the measure of calories, right now in the next section. So let's go ahead and do that. When we're talking about calorimetry, we're talking about the measure of calories, and that can be on a various number of subjects. That can be on humans, on animals, unless you don't see a distinction between the two, and also on food, figuring out the number of calories in food. Now, there are two different methods for figuring out the number of calories in let's say, human metabolism or a particular food. And those two methods are indirect and direct calorimetry. So when we're talking about direct calorimetry, which is actually the first calorimetry that came about, that one was discovered in the 18th century by a French chemist by the name of Antoine Lavoisier. And Lavoisier came up with this system where you put a subject in a box and then surround that box with water or ice. I believe he used ice, but later iterations of the same direct calorimetry used water, and we are able to measure the heat production off that subject. So specifically, in this instance, we're talking more about animals and we're talking more about humans. So, well, he used animals, but we can now do this on humans if we have a large enough box. You don't want to just stuff somebody in like a cardboard box or something. No, this is a insulated, reinforced box, and all the variables are measured precisely to figure out mathematically later on how much heat production is produced by that subject inside the box. So the reason why that's important is because in that insulated box, heat production comes off of the human, comes off of the subject, whatever that is, and then it translates to the walls of that box, and then it goes through the walls of the box and then heats the water surrounding the entire box. Now, that being the case, then you can measure the amount of heat increase from standard water temperature, or what the temperature of the water before that subject was in there, and compare that to when the subject was in there, and then you're able to find that discrepancy, and then that discrepancy you are able to, based off that heat production, because again, heat production from the body is indicative of our caloric consumption, because calories are used to create heat, and we are then able to translate that to actually figuring out the difference in heat between a standard and the amount of heat that's released by that person or that subject, whatever that is. So that was direct calorimetry, and that was the first and simplest way at the time to figure out how many calories are in a particular subject. The system works a little bit differently when we're talking about figuring out the number of calories in food. So again, if we know that calories are based off of temperature, because we see a 1 degree Celsius rise in 1 gram of water, if we know that, then we can apply that to food, we can apply that to human metabolism, because we're able to measure then roughly what human metabolism is doing by the amount of energy that it's expending, the amount of heat that it's releasing. So, and that's why we have kind of a steady body temperature, for example. However, when it comes to food, we're not necessarily measuring metabolism, we're trying to figure out how much energy is in that food content. So, that said, it's the same basic principle. We put a food inside of a chamber called a bomb calorimeter. A bomb calorimeter. What a mouthful. Okay, a bomb calorimeter. We put the food in there, and then the only addition to that is that we actually have to heat the food. So we know the amount of energy that we're putting into the system. We're putting a certain amount of energy into the system to burn the food, and then that extra release, so the amount of energy we put into the system, and then it burns the food, and then that extra boost of energy that we see released from the food, as well as the energy that we put into the food to make it burn, energy, heat, however you want to explain that. And then we see that translation again on the walls of that chamber, and then from the walls of that chamber into the water around it. And then from around that water, we're able to measure the temperature increase from a standard state. And then we go through again a bunch of mathematical formulas, and we end up figuring out how many calories were actually in that food. So as you can see, all the variables are always controlled. You have a control for the amount of energy or the amount of heat that you're placing on the food. You have a standard temperature for water. You measure things before things happen, and then you go through the procedure and burn the food, and then you're able to figure out how much of a change there was and then compare that to the amount of heat that you personally added to that actual food as a researcher. So everything is controlled for, and then that's how we're able to mathematically figure out how much heat production is produced by that food. And that heat we can then assume to calories, because again, we've got our water component because we're heating the water, as well as we've got that heat component because the heat released from the food, and then so plus heat and water, then that gives us our definition for a calorie. So what does that mean? A calorie then is not an actual tangible thing. It's not like a carbohydrate. It is not like a protein. It is not like a fat. Although those macromolecules have calories, they offer us calories, our body uses them as calories. Calories is simply a unit of energy based off of the heat production that food or that metabolism, whatever you're trying to measure, is releasing. So then we're able to measure that based off of a standard and see how much of an increase in release of heat, which equals a release of energy, and that gives us our caloric amount. Now, that is just direct calorimetry. On the other hand, we have indirect calorimetry, and we came up with this indirect calorimetry much more recently, and we're able to use indirect calorimetry, and we want to use indirect calorimetry because having a giant box that is surrounded by water is highly expensive, very expensive, and not to mention it is difficult to measure exercise, for example. If a person is inside a box and they have a treadmill going, for example, because you don't want them just running back and forth inside this little box like a rat. You want them to be on a treadmill or on a bike or something. That treadmill, the friction, the movement of that treadmill and the movement of that bike will also create heat, and it's difficult to quantify and then subtract that heat and figure out exactly how much heat was produced by the subject alone. So we came up with an alternative. And that alternative is only applicable to metabolism. We're not talking about it being applicable to food, because food doesn't release oxygen, it doesn't release CO2. Well, at least not in a metabolic standpoint. So that said, we came up with indirect calorimetry. And indirect calorimetry is basically just a measure of oxygen compared to the use of CO2, and we've been able to figure out that for every liter of oxygen that we consume, we're roughly using about 5 calories. So for every liter of oxygen that we breathe, no matter the circumstance, we're using about 5 calories. So in that case, we don't need a box anymore. We don't need to measure that against water. We're able to then just put a mask on, and that's where that VO2 exchange comes from. Being able to compare CO2 to oxygen consumption. So oxygen consumption and the amount of CO2 that we then exhale, and we put a mask over our nose and over our mouth, and we're able to measure, even during exercise, how much of a consumption of oxygen that we use. And then we're able to go through, again, a mathematical formula and figure out that based on the knowledge that every liter of oxygen we consume is roughly equivalent to 5 calories. And yes, that doesn't matter based on body composition. So that said, if you would like to know more information on that, I do have other articles and other videos that explain how we figured that stuff out in far more detail, talking about the respiratory exchange ratio. I do have an article and a video which I will link below, as well as trying to figure out how many calories we expend. How can you figure out, with these mathematical formulas using indirect calorimetry, how can you figure out how many calories that you've expended? And I do have a video on that as well, which again I will go ahead and link below in the description box. So those are the two types of calorimetry, and I just want to hammer this in just one quick time again. Calories are a unit of measurement. We measure the production of heat. We don't measure the actual calories themselves. The calories are water and heat. How heat plays on water. That's an actual calorie. That's a unit of measurement. That's a way that we're able to quantify. And it's not the same as a carbohydrate. It's not an actual physical thing that you sit there and hold. Like you can hold a piece of bread, for example, which is made up of, let's say, 20 grams of carbohydrates. It's not a unit that you can actually hold, but it is a unit of measurement that's been established. And that's where that definition comes from, using 1 gram and 1 calorie. So 1 gram is equal to 1 gram of water being heated by 1 degree Celsius equals that 1 calorie. So that's that. Hopefully I made sense. I mean, I tried to make as much physiological sense as possible. I tried to explain where this idea came from so that we don't just go about thinking, okay, well, just a calorie is just, whatever, I don't know. It's just that definition. That's just what it is. Now, hopefully you understand why and where that came from.
This is the summary of the video for those of you that need a quick recap. If not, please subscribe and check out the attached article.
Alright, for those of you that did not want to go through the entire video, I do have a summary section for you right now. We talked about a calorie. We talked about how a calorie is not the same as a macronutrient. It's not the same as a carbohydrate, a fat, or protein. It's not something you can actually hold. It is a unit of energy. And that unit of energy is defined as an increase of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Now, that's not a very useful definition in terms of physiology, but really to explain that entirely, you're probably going to have to go through the rest of the video, but I will try my best here. Really, a calorie is just using energy that we use for heat production, usually, and we can figure out how many calories are in food. We can figure out how many calories are used by our metabolism, by the heat production that both of those create. So we have to actually burn food, and we can control certain variables so we figure out how much energy we input, and we see how much energy we end up releasing by heat. So we measure the amount of heat, and then we go through a ton of calculations to figure out how much energy that ends up being. Now, there are several different ways of measuring calories, and calories are measured by direct and indirect calorimetry. When we're talking about direct calorimetry, we're talking about measuring the exact heat production of that subject. And when we're talking about food, we're talking about bomb calorimetry, which is the exact same thing. It's direct calorimetry, but instead of being in a large chamber for a living individual, you would just put it in a small chamber, the food in a small chamber, and control the amount of heat that you put on that food to burn it, and then you compare that amount, that standard amount that you've put into the system, and compare that to what you get out of the system, and that discrepancy then gives you a heat discrepancy, and that heat discrepancy then gives you an energy discrepancy, and that energy discrepancy is the amount of energy, the amount of calories that are used to heat water, because throughout both of those mechanisms, both direct calorimetry systems on a living organism or on food, both use water. That heat exchange is based straight on water. So we're able to measure the direct impact on water. And that's where we came up with that definition of a calorie being a gram of water heated by 1 degree Celsius. However, after a while, we figured out that there are more efficient ways of doing this, and we came up with indirect calorimetry. Indirect calorimetry is just knowing that a liter of oxygen consumed is roughly 5 calories spent. So knowing that one bit of information, we can then measure how much inhalation from our nose and our mouth, and that's why you see those people with funny masks every once in a while when they go to a research lab. No, I'm not talking about the person at a gym that's nonsensical. I'm talking about if you go to an actual research lab and they put a mask on your face, then they're measuring the amount of oxygen that you inhale and the amount of CO2 that you release. And then they're able to measure that and give you a rough caloric amount. And that is useful not only because it's, well, one, it's less time intensive, but two, it's less expensive, but three, you can also measure exercise, which you couldn't necessarily do in direct calorimetry. So hopefully that was a good, quick roundabout way of going about things. But honestly, if you want to know more about calories, you should probably watch the rest of the video. Anyways, I hope this video was informational, and I really do hope so, because I put a lot of work into this stuff. If you'd like to check out the article to learn more information, then check it out. It is linked below. It is free. And yeah, that's it. Please subscribe if you haven't already. It certainly means quite a bit to me when people subscribe, because I put like I said, I put a ton of work into this stuff. I really do. And I hope that I am helping you as well as this stuff is helping me. Okay, so I'll catch you in the next video, and I hope you have an awesome day. Stay focused. See ya.